Malo lau mari ho e ki mo lele ai tonga solo mo volang kotoa ta talele ki mo tolu. Ki tau polokalama Talanoa e ahoni me homo le iti o mo televisione Pasifika me se ne I hivai funua ni usawele. O kulangelanga ia mo honga ia e polokalamani ke maofenga maalie ke whakahoko hawhe po Talanoa aki e ahoni. Pea mo e konsela whakalangilangi kuia o Tonga ki Australia ki he wahifunua New South Wales ko Louise Waterhouse. We're very, very honoured on our Pasifika TV and Radio today to be joined here by Mrs Louise Waterhouse, who is the Consul-General of the Kingdom of Tonga here in Sydney. We're actually here at the Consulate today and really, really pleased to have this opportunity, this rare opportunity for a discussion and a conversation this afternoon. Louise, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciate you having an opportunity, an audience for us to speak with you today. But before we go any further, could you just take a moment to formally introduce yourself and your family's unique connection to the Kingdom of Tonga?
Yes, first of all, it's a pleasure, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk today. Yes, my family connection goes back into the 1940s, when my father was lucky enough to go through university and do arts law at Sydney University with the late King, that's Tauwhahau Tupou IV. And they both were at opposite ends of the spectrum. The late King was the first Tongan citizen to have a tertiary education, and he was very studious and very thoughtful, and my father was having a good time. He was also studious, but he also enjoyed his way, and I think they were a bit of yin and yang, how they connected. And so fast forward a couple of decades, 3 decades, my father was doing things within the Pacific, and suddenly he had a call through a contact saying, His Majesty is summoning you to the kingdom. And we were actually together over in America at the time, and our trip was cut short, and Dad said, well, I have to go, His Majesty's calling. So he called in to see His Majesty, and they talked about lots of ideas, and one of those was about how Tonga can really utilize its position as a sovereign nation within the Pacific strategically and also geopolitically to further itself. And for example, my father suggested, why don't we offer asylum to the Shah of Persia? That was the big thing at the time. Mm. And so His Majesty said, what a good idea. Okay, great, you go and do that, but I better make you the Consul-General because you need to have some authority. And my father said, oh, well, look, I'm quite busy, but yes, of course I'll do it for a year and we'll, see what we can do. And it turns out my father loved so much. He loved the Tongan people, and he loved being able to do things to make a small difference. And he became, when he passed away, it was his 48th year as being the Consul-General, the Honorary Consul-General for the Kingdom of Tonga. So starting in 1975, and he passed away in 2018, 19. Yes, so from the time that he was Consul-General, he saw a big change in the Tongan community within Sydney and Australia. Of course, our consulate is responsible for the whole of Australia, and from being really a handful of Tongans, entrepreneurial Tongans who took the initiative to come to Australia, and he also helped them establish themselves, and in many cases gave them jobs and really helped, I think, build their confidence in their new land. And they built themselves slowly but surely, and no one was more proud than my father to see how well the Tongan community had done and how hardworking they were, and to see them prospering. And he'd come and say, oh, they're doing so well, and of course anybody that would meet my father, he would browbeat them about Tonga. He wouldn't stop talking about Tonga and how beautiful it is and how the opportunities are there and the perfect climate, better than Hawaii, and so he was a great advocate for Tonga. It was part of his heart. And then in about the early 90s, the Crown Prince said to me one day, Louise, I know you're very active and you help a lot. I'd like to make you the Vice Consul because I think it would be important for your father to have that support, and so I was made Vice Consul. And then in 2000, the current king, he was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, he then promoted me to become a full consul, honorary consul. And then on the passing of my father, the sad passing, His Majesty then immediately made me the Consul-General, trying to fill my father's shoes, but they're big shoes to fill.
fully appreciate or fully be aware of the roles and responsibilities of the consulate and also your role. Would you give us a little bit of an insight of what does your role and functions and responsibilities look like on the daily basis here in Sydney?
Yes, well, a consular officer is a person who's looking after the people of the original country. So in other words, we are here to help the Tongan people living in Australia, to also help the Tongan government with issues they may have within Australia, and also to help investors who may want to do things in Tonga, and of course looking after the royal family when they come here on visits in conjunction, of course, with the High Commission. We were the only representatives in Australia until 2008, and fortunately in 2008 we had the High Commission set up in Canberra. And so now we work very closely together with Her Royal Highness Princess Angelica Latufui-Peka Tukuaho, and of course also with Curtis Tuihangani. And we work hand in glove, and I'm very grateful for their support, and it means that we can all do so much working in together. I think the other thing I like to say is that because I don't actually have a job description, apart from what I've outlined, I love to try and paint outside the margins. So if there's something I see there's an opportunity, I'll say, oh, okay, how could we do something here? Maybe I can introduce this, or I can find this person, or through contacts I may have, we can do something. And that's made a big difference in many ways. And I think it helps because sometimes, you know, the protocol is very polite and shy, and perhaps I can be a bit more cheeky and ask for things that maybe someone else might not be daring to do.
On that topic of asking questions, not daring to do, I know that you've had some amazing networking opportunities with the recent tsunami crisis in Tonga, and there's a lot of help that's on its way from Australia. Could you share a little bit about what you've been doing in the background with regards to the support and relief process going on the ground in Tonga?
Yes, well, of course, it's absolute devastation. The catastrophe of the likes never seen before. And I say never seen before, not in recorded history. And the very first message that I received from Tonga after the tsunami was a week later, and it was from none other than His Majesty. And he said words to the effect, our ancestors, they survived without learning and without technology. How can we, their descendants, give up and lie down? Not on your life. And that message of resilience brought a tear to my eye, and it was very interesting because I was just about to do a BBC live interview. And so I quickly messaged back and said, may I please share it, Your Majesty? He said, yes, you may. And so I was able to share it with the people of the BBC. And in fact, one of His Majesty's friends happened to be listening, and he said that it moved him to a tear as well. So, but coming back to what we've been able to do, of course, we're all devastated and shattered, and we thought, well, what can we do? And so the very first step was to say, well, what's needed immediately? And we couldn't have communications with Tonga because the cable was cut, because, as you probably know, it runs right beside the Hunga volcano island. And so it's the shortest route, but probably the worst location to put a cable. And so it was very, very traumatic because we couldn't get hold of anybody. But as soon as there was a bit of telecommunication through the phones, we were able to have WhatsApp messages. And fortunately, I'd been liaising with the former Minister for Health, and so I was able to get messages through to her, what do you need? And so we had an emergency list of supplies that they needed. And also Her Majesty was one of the first to respond to say, we need, and she gave us a list through the High Commission. And so one of those on that was clothing. So our first container, which went last week, was with 20,000 items of brand new clothing, including 5,000 pairs of Havana thongs. So they'll be very fashionable in Tonga.
Yeah.
And all sizes, right across the size range, of course, climate purposeful, and we have more where that's come from. And then also 30 boxes of medical supplies, including bandages, syringes, masks, PPE equipment, all sorts of things that they're desperately needing, including a pallet of cleaning agents so they can desensitize and disinfect surfaces. So we've been able to get that straight away on the boat. The boats were booked out, but we pulled on a few heartstrings and we were able to get a slot straight away on the boats. And then as well through the High Commission, we've been in liaison with Swire Shipping, who reached out to us saying they wanted to help. And they've been able to move heaven and earth to get us more slots and to sponsor a number of containers for bona fide donations to go to Tonga. So we're deeply, deeply grateful to Swire and VLS shipping, freight or logistics to help us in that regard.
Fantastic. Now, the Winter Olympics are currently underway in Beijing, but back in 2018 they were being held in Pyeongchang,
Yes.
over there in South Korea. And I know that you were part of a delegation in supporting our Tonga's Winter Olympics team, even though Tonga has no snow or ice. Could you tell us a little bit about how that experience panned out?
Yes, well, the very first time that Tonga was at the Winter Olympics, which, as you say, is quite curious given Tonga has no snow or ice, was with Bruno Bernani. And Bruno Bernani was a luge racer. And he did the impossible in that you have to be in the luge, you have to be of certain proficiency. You have to be in the top 36 in the world to be able to go to the Olympics, because it's a very dangerous sport where they're going at 150 kilometres an hour on a little piece of metal down an ice chute. So it's extraordinarily dangerous and people can die. In fact, they did have some deaths in one of the Olympics. So Bruno Bernani, through training, through his German connections, he was able to get himself to the level to qualify for the Olympics. And at the time, through my husband's connections, we were able to organise a sponsorship through one of the world top ski wear companies called Bogner. And so the Bogner gave the uniforms for the team, and we were voted by Yahoo Media as the best dressed team at the Olympics.
Wow.
And Bruno Bernani did a wonderful job, and we had hosted a reception by the Germans at their German house for Bruno Bernani, and he became a celebrity in his own right, in Germany especially. So then fast forward on, we have the wonderful Peter Tupou, who of course broke the internet when he went to Rio and bared his chest and covered in oil, and I think every female in the world was looking at me saying, my goodness, where's this God come from? Well, he then set out to do the impossible to be able to compete in both Winter and Summer Olympics. So he then trained very hard on his road skis because he thought, well, I could do cross-country skiing, you know. And but of course, it's a lot more in cross-country skiing than meets the eye. So he had many times where he kissed the concrete, he's told us. And then he went over to Europe, and by harum scarum, he somehow managed, missing planes, missing this and that because of climate and issues, he managed to scrape in and qualify and did us all proud. And not only was he able to perform at the Olympics and did well, but he also was able to be a wonderful ambassador for Tonga, because everyone was so interested in this Tongan who's in the cross country, of course, you know, an island state. We had a press conference for him, and we thought, oh, well, it'll be in a nice normal room. They gave us the largest auditorium at the Olympics, and we thought, oh, this is pretty good. Well, Peter filled up the auditorium with journalists. Wow. But I could tell they were out to have the mickey out of Peter, because I could see they were thinking, oh, what is this guy doing, blah, blah, blah. The very first question came, tell me, what's this story about the olive oil you're putting on your chest? And Peter had them eating out of his hand. He said, excuse me, let me get this straight. Olive oil is for my salad, coconut oil is for my body. And the whole auditorium just burst into hysterics, and he just had everybody. And once again, he broke the internet, and he had no shortage of offers from all the beautiful girls from South Korea. So we could have married him off quite a few times, I think.
That's fantastic. Now, I know you've got a long history of involvement in various developmental projects in the Kingdom of Tonga. I feel personally that not a lot of those projects may be well known. So I want to give you an opportunity to share on some of the projects that you've been involved in Tonga.
Yes, well, for me, to be able to help is enough of a reward. I don't believe in shouting from the rooftops, because it's not about me, it's about what the end results are. And yes, there have been some projects that I've been able to be involved with that I'm so proud of and have made a difference. And one of those projects was a little book we produced and sponsored called A Little Seahorse in Love. And it came about, it's a lovely story. My mother-in-law is German, because my husband's German, and she comes from a little town in Bavaria, and I call it deepest, darkest Bavaria, because hardly anyone speaks English, and it's just quaint how you imagine the picture postcard of Germany. And she read in her local newspaper about a story that was written by a famous author for children about the creatures of the sea of the Pacific. In particular, he dedicated his book to the King of Tonga, which was quite curious in the middle of deepest, darkest Bavaria. And the reason being was that the late King of Tonga, that's Tupou IV, he was the very first head of state that came to congratulate Germany on reunification. back in the early 90s. And he was a boy that had to escape from his home. As an 11-year-old, he escaped with his life and could never go back. So for him, reunification was a very moving moment. So my mother-in-law tracked him down. He was living in a little cottage. He'd been a professor with the Goethe Institute, dropped out and said, I don't want that anymore. Dropped out to write his books for children. And so she found him up in the mountains in a little hut without running water or electricity and said, well, you know, I'm so excited what you've done. And by the way, my daughter-in-law happens to be the Honorary Consul for the Kingdom of Tonga. And so when we came over to visit her at Christmas time, we obviously got together. And Dr. Shermer, Professor Shermer, he kindly allowed us to, well, I said to him, I'd love to be able to translate the book and produce it for Tonga, for Tongan children. And so he allowed us to do that. So it was a work in progress, and the next visit I took to Tonga, I was talking with Mary Whanua, who you would know from the Matangi Tonga. And I said to Mary, I can't quite work it out. I think we'll probably do it in Tongan so that the Tongan people can have it. And she said, Louise, what would be the very best is if you could have it in Tongan and English, because we don't have a book for children in both languages. We have books in Tongan, we have books in English, but the only thing in both languages is the Bible. So I then had a mission. So we went back to Germany, and I was able to help the translation into English and to supervise that and to produce it. And then Her Majesty, Queen Nasipau, as married at the stage before she was the Queen, she helped for us to find a person who could do the translation. And Biongo Muffy, she was the one that she selected, who was her old school teacher. And she in her 80s sat down with me at this table and worked together and worked on that translation. And it was a laborious task, a labor of love, and she worked day and night. And of course, when we sent it over to Germany to be published or printed, they couldn't work out what to do with their glottal stops and other things, so it all went haywire. And so she was stressed out and said, "Oh my goodness, you know, if this goes to print, this will make a fool of us all." I said, "Don't worry." So I painstakingly went through, corrected it all, and we produced. And because the artist was and the author was so particular, he wanted it printed in Germany. So we then, for His Majesty's birthday in 2003, we presented this book for him as a birthday present. A Little Seahorse in Love.
Oh, beautiful.
And it has beautiful illustrations. And it's all about a little seahorse who goes on an adventure off Tonga and is befriended with all sorts of creatures of the sea, including a kingfish and also a whale, and how he finds his love, another seahorse.
And is there copies of this book available in Tonga, in schools over in the Kingdom of Tonga?
Well, there should be. We donated, all up was 10,000 copies of the book. And so I hope they're still around, and certainly they were available at the time. It's a few years ago now. But what I'd love to share with you, you mentioned about projects. This little book had a lot of ripples. It made its impact because we gave it to His Majesty, and he was very chuffed because, as we all know, under His Majesty's reign, education was such a priority, and he was able to achieve 98.5% literacy, which is probably unrepeated almost anywhere in the Western world. Just extraordinary. Sadly, a few years on, 2006, His Majesty was on his last, and he summons my father and myself to Auckland to say goodbye, to say his farewells, which was very sad and very traumatic, but very symbolic as well. His Majesty was ill and he couldn't talk very well, but he said some words to me and I couldn't quite understand it, and he repeated it, and then his aide repeated it, and what he was saying was, "Louise, I want you to work on Tongan guest workers." And I thought, what is that? And the aide said, "This is where workers come from Tonga and help other countries, short term, medium term." So I thought, oh gosh, that's a challenge. That's really going to challenge me, but okay, that's a dying wish. That's what I'll have to do. And so I made inquiries, and it was politically not very acceptable, especially in Australia, where they were saying, we'll take local jobs, etc. But nevertheless, it was always in my mind. And fast forward another year, I was in a restaurant with my husband, and this beautiful little girl kept coming over to talk to us. She was enchanting. She would have been 5, maybe 6. And I said to my husband, I'd love to give her one of our books. I have one in the car. So he went and got the book and we gave it to this little girl. She was so excited. She ran back to her mother and showed her the book. And the mother came over and said, "That's so kind of you. Thank you so much. But may I ask you what the language is?" And I felt a little silly because I thought, well, she can't read Tongan, obviously. And I said, "Well, it's Tongan, but she can read the English." And she said, "Tongan?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, actually, I'm Dr. Manjula Luthria, and I've just been appointed to the World Bank here in Australia, and one of my countries is Tonga." Wow. And I said, "Wow." And then we got to talk, and she said, "I've got 3 projects that I want to achieve in my 3 years, and one of those is seasonal workers." I felt like giving her a hug, and I told her the story of the book and His Majesty, and how His Majesty must have been steering things from above, like a puppeteer. And so we worked very closely for the next year or 2 on lobbying, going to see all the different powers, the politicians, and when necessary, I'd be accompanied by the Tongan community, and we really made an impression. So when it was finally approved, it was approved as a trial program. But the bureaucrats-to-be, they for some reason chose 3 countries which did not include Tonga. But my friend Dr. Luthria said, "Louise, I perhaps shouldn't be sharing this with you, but I actually swapped and put Tonga in there because I knew you'd be ready and I knew you deserved it." So Tonga was part of the first trial program, and of the 1,500 slots that were available, Tonga used up nearly 1,200. And the Tongan workers did us so proud. They worked so hard and they did the work of many, many fold of other workers. We used to hear that they do the work of 5 from other countries, and I think you mentioned before 10, depending on which ones you get, but it has become the mainstay of the industries, the fruit picking, the grape harvesting, and other industries right across the eastern seaboard. And I think a lot of those farmers would go bust if they didn't have the support of the Tongan workers. And the happy story is that it actually is now becoming the most important source of income to Tonga behind remittances. That's more than exports, more than the export of squash, more than tourism, more than aid, is the seasonal worker program. And what's so powerful is that it enables individuals. So unlike aid, which goes from government to government or NGO to NGO, this is going from an individual who works their little heart out. They earn a lot of money, it's their money, they go back, they decide the best use for their money, and no one can spend their money better than somebody who's earned it themselves. And so I feel in a small way I've had a little role, a little cog, through the help of His Majesty and through the help of the little Seahorse to bring such an extraordinary program to being.
It's actually a really great, it's a good segue into my next question. You would have seen, I mean, during your father's time and also into recent times, the Tongan community here in Australia, from very small numbers to it's expanded to a very large community now. Upon reflection, what are some of the achievements or contributions you've noticed of Tongans here in Australia to Australia as a country?
Well, I like to say Tonga and Tongans punch above their weight because the Tongan people are very special. They work very hard, they're good hearts, and they're a good role model for the rest of Western society, I have to say, sadly, because the Tongan values are what it's all about. It's the values of working hard, the values of family, the values of looking after each other, and the values of sharing. And that's where the Tongans set themselves apart. Also, we have so many wonderful role models within our society in Australia. You only have to look at the number of fabulous world-class sportsmen, extraordinary. Not just the Peter Tafatufuas, it's the Daniel Tupous, it's the different sportsmen, the Willie O's from going back, you know, a couple of decades that made their mark and have really underpinned Australian sport in so many ways. And then we have also Tongan musical talents. We have some of the most beautiful. Last night at the Whenu charity raising for the tsunami relief, I was blown away by the singing. Just extraordinary, the talent. And of course, going to church in Tonga is the best thing you could ever do. Can't do anything better than to go and listen to the a cappella singing of those choirs. Just fabulous. And of course, through the royal family. Tonga is the only royal family or monarchy in the Pacific and the longest consistent bloodline of any monarchy in the world. As you know, it goes back 1,000 years. We have a wonderful monarchy because they're very well intentioned, and all they want to do is do the right thing for Tonga, and they want to help their people. As I said, the first message I got was from the King after the tsunami. The first written message was from the Queen, saying what they needed. Their heart and soul is there right throughout everything they do.
2019, the Commonwealth of Australia and the Kingdom of Tonga lost a great statesman in the form of his late William Waterhouse, your father. If you were to pause and to reflect on how you'd like the people of Tonga to remember your father's legacy, what would that look like?
My father he was a great visionary, and they always say that the smartest people are the people that have the vision for the future. And he was a visionary, and he could see back in the 70s or even earlier the opportunities for Tonga. He could see that Tonga had so much it could achieve on the world stage, and he worked tirelessly to make Tonga, to awareness for Tonga, to build awareness, but also to build respect for Tonga. And I like to think that in no small part, the respect that we hold Tonga in Australia is through to his way of promoting Tonga and spreading the message of the Tongan people and the Tongan talents. And he would drive everybody mad. Everybody he'd meet, he'd talk about Tonga, which was great because they were all fascinated. And my father, I like to think he was larger than life, and he certainly gave Tonga a wonderful stage to be able to express itself. And no one was more proud of him than when we had 40 years of being the longest serving Honorary Consul-General in the world, not just for Tonga, but in the world. And His Majesty came over for our event at Parliament House, he was able to look back and think about some of the things that he's achieved.
Reflecting on some of those memories from that time, including yourself coming into the Vice and also now the full-time role, there would be some funny moments, I'm sure, funny experiences that have occurred over those many decades in terms of Tonga-Australia relations and community and whatnot. Would you like to share on any humorous moments, perhaps?
Yes, well, there have been some wonderful moments, and Tonga has enriched my life in so many ways, and I feel so blessed to be able to be in this privileged position to be able to make a small difference. No matter how small, if we all can just make a small change in the world, then we've done what we've set out to achieve. But I've also had some fabulous moments, and when Sydney was hosting the Olympics, I reached out to the Talanoa and said, "Can I help you with anything, and what can we do?" And full of enthusiasm, and they came up with different ideas, and they were a bit behind the times. They perhaps weren't quite up to things, and so with not a lot of time, my husband was able to organise a full sponsorship with Adidas, so they got all the very latest equipment, and when the weightlifter came along, he said to my husband, "I don't have any shoes." And Kunta said, "Here you are." And he brought him 3 pairs of shoes, and he burst into tears. He'd never had weightlifting shoes. And interestingly enough, one of the athletes from the Olympics was there at the fundraising last night. So she actually migrated to Australia afterwards. Wow. But coming back to Tonga, we organised for the uniforms as well, and I suggested to His late Majesty, Tupou IV, that it would be wonderful if he could honour us with his presence to come to the Olympics. And he agreed to come. Wow. So he became the #1 dignitary to come to the Sydney Olympics. But of course, Australia is very egalitarian, as you probably know. And so when I set out to organise accommodation and the way he should be treated with dignity, they said, "Oh no, look, we're so busy with the Olympics, we have all these different prime ministers and so coming, everyone's going on a bus." And I said, "You don't put the King of Tonga on a bus." And they said, "Look, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is." And I said, "It's impossible. You cannot put the King of Tonga on a bus." And I said, "There must be some way." And they said, "The only possible way if he were a security risk. Then we could give him his own delegation that he could have security protection." And I thought, oh, okay. Well, it could be he's a security risk. He is the head of state. So I contacted the federal police, and I knew I was being a bit cheeky, but I said, "Look, I really need your help, and this is the problem, and it would be a terrible, terrible slight to the people of Tonga and to His Majesty to put him on a bus with everybody else." And the head of the federal police in charge of the Olympics delegation, he said, "Are you related to Bill?" Because I gave my name as Louise Waterhouse. I said, "Yes, of course I am. He's my father." "Well, your father did this amazing favour for me back in the 60s. He allowed me, when I brought a boxer from Fiji, to stay in his hotel for free. So I tell you what, I think His Majesty is a security risk, and he will have his own duty, his own dedicated 2 police officers and also driver and car, and he will be treated with the dignity he deserves. So the King, His Majesty, was the only dignitary at the Olympics to be given his own car and his own detail.
Wow.
So
that's fantastic.
That's come about through a bit of luck, serendipitousness, and so we were very pleased about it. And then there was a very funny personal side. Having done all the things for the delegation, I didn't appreciate the side benefits. I just was doing it because I wanted to make sure Tonga had the best, and we got the best accommodation. They had beautiful new townhouses, and they had the best uniforms, and we really managed to get them presenting themselves very well. And I was made the attaché, which meant that I was the sort of the go-between for Tonga and Australia. But the attaché then, as the attaché, I was invited to march on the opening ceremony. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, well, I suppose I could do that without appreciating the significance of it. And when my husband organised all this wonderful equipment for the team, which they'd never seen before, they appointed him as the manager for the team. And so they invited him to walk as well. And my husband, being German, he said to me, "Now, Louise, you make sure you walk with dignity. Don't wave too much, just wave, okay, you know, very dignified, and remember, you're representing Tonga." I said, "Yes, I will." So, of course, I did exactly that. But as we walked onto the big oval at the stadium, one of the journalists recognised my husband because he's quite high profile as a former sports star himself, and said, "Gunther, what are you doing here?" And, of course, wearing a Tongan uniform. And with that, my husband got all excited, and he started to wave frenetically. But, of course, I couldn't see because he was behind me. And I only caught him out when the photo appeared on the front page of the German newspapers. So it's what you call sprung badly.
Louise, you've travelled to the Kingdom of Tonga many, many times over the years. Is there any part of Tonga which has a very strong sentimental value, or is a favourite spot perhaps in the kingdom?
Well, there's so many fabulous things. Obviously, the times that I've been privileged to spend with the royal family and at Consular House, and at being part of the coronation, 2 coronations, and to wear my courtier's uniform, such an honour to be able to do so. And I wear that with great honour even in Australia. I wore it on the weekend at Government House for the planting of a tree to mark the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, the Queen of England's Platinum Jubilee. And of course everybody is gobsmacked by the wondrous uniform which His Majesty Tupou V designed. And so that's been a wonderful experience. I tend to go there and try and fit as much in as I can and not spend enough time enjoying Tonga. But one time I was invited by this terrific entrepreneur, adventurer, Don McIntyre, and he'd actually gone to Tonga to reenact the mutiny on the Bounty. And that was extraordinary because he built a little boat and he sailed with 2 volunteers that had never sailed before and 1 other sailor, and reenacted the voyage. But he said Bligh was a better sailor than him because he had his GPS equipment locked in a box, but he had to go and reach for that equipment at one stage. But I did say to Don when he was planning this trip, "Don, this is quite dangerous, And he said, "Don't worry, Louise, I'll be fine." And I said, no, it's dangerous. You'll fall in love with Tonga and never want to leave. And that's exactly what happened. He fell in love with Namuka and set up in Namuka Iki with the blessing of the Crown Prince, and he built the Royal Namuka Yacht Club. But of course, now, with the tsunami, his yacht club has been razed to the ground. But the lovely memory I have is when he invited me and my family to come sailing with the whales, which we did about 5 years ago. And so to sail around the islands of Hapai, no engine, and then to see these graceful giants of the sea and to be able to jump in and swim with them was just incredible. And I have to say, my confession is a very poor photographer. I took my GoPro along and I was filming, and a whale came right up, a baby whale came up to me and wanted to talk. And I'm filming dedication to duty, and the whale comes closer and closer and within a metre, and I'm still filming dedication. And with that, the mother comes by and says to her calf, come on, darling, let's go. And the whale swims past about 1.5 meters. This giant tail just sort of almost gets me, but she knew where I was. She wasn't threatening me at all. So I suppose if I had to say, that's one of the highlights of my life, is to be able to swim with those beautiful giants of the sea.
For Tongans who are migrating to Australia, or even Australian-born Tongans, how would you encourage them in terms of their life here in Australia? What's an encouragement to our Tongans who have just arrived in Australia, and also to Australian-born Tongans of Tongan heritage but are born here?
I always say to the Tongan community that, please, you have to cherish your heritage. If you don't remember where you've been, how can you know where you're going? If you forget your heritage, you're half a person. If you acknowledge your heritage and honour your heritage, you're better than everybody else. And I think that's the greatest message one can give. Be proud of your heritage. Practice your heritage. Enjoy your heritage.
Your family has made a wonderful contribution to Australia and also to the Kingdom of Tonga. What drives Louise Waterhouse? What is your motivation to keep you going and keeping you passionate for Tonga and all the great work you do?
Well, I think it's a great privilege to be able to help, and I think that's what it's all about. It's about, if you're fortunate enough to be in a position where you can make a small change, where you can do things that do make a difference, then that's what makes everything worthwhile. And I feel sometimes, I think, why am I so content? Why am I so happy, so fulfilled? It's because of Tonga, because of my work that I can do for Tonga.
There's another book that we've got here today, and this is leading into my last question, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It's really a testimony of your father's work, his contribution, not just to Tonga, but more broadly with his contribution. For yourself, though, you mentioned earlier you're filling big shoes, and I think you're filling those shoes really, really well. In 10 or 20 years' time, 30, however long the future may hold, what would you like your legacy? How would you like people to remember Louise Waterhouse, Consul-General of the Kingdom of Tonga?
Louise was the girl that had a passion for Tonga.
We want to thank you so much for your time today, for opening up your office, for sharing those insights and stories about your family's connection to Tonga, the great work you're doing. Obviously, the tsunami is another area you've mentioned as well today, and we're really, really honoured to be here and have you on our program today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be able to speak with you.
Ko Louise Waterhouse pokia ko tau konsela whakalangilangi koia o Tonga ki Australia, na ni kao mai he tau proklama koia ahoni ke whai hawhi pō Talanoa aki o whekau aki pe mga hingawe lava mea a hono whāmiri ki Tonga pe mo e kainga koia kainga Tonga o kunau nofo au nofo mai ki Australia. Me homo proklama koia leti o mo televisione Pasifika ko Ausulieni, malo pito mo mea mai, ka mo mea tu au whātou.